Hey guys, it's Crazy Tom once again, bringing you another edition of What Drives Me Crazy here for this Tuesday, June the 30th. Yes, the last day of the first half of the year 2020, and the last day of a month which I think has saw more uprising than we have seen in years. Whether it is for the right reasons or not, we'll find out soon enough. However, I wanted to bring something up to you to end this first half of 2020 because we had so many events. Of course, this month was Pride Month. This month marked Juneteenth, the end of slavery, and so many protests and also unfortunate riots and loots that took place across the nation, which unfortunately, some of which have not been addressed yet. I'm not sure exactly what the sound is behind me, but I apologize for that. But what I want to do is let you know something in regards to what I want to talk about. It seems like any and everything that is being touched on our history is now being labeled racist or being taught hate and stuff like that from centuries ago. And now they want everything torn down. They want every name changed. They want everything completely to the standards of what a movement wants. And in my personal opinion, I feel there is a very big threat because of the fact I'm sure whomever's deciding these things for us, whomever's deciding to hide statues, vandalize statues, tear down American history, and label it, and in some cases unnecessarily, without understanding the history, well, I think those people might be in for a very rude awakening because karma always seems to hit. Let me share this with you. Yes, we know slavery should no longer exist, but is it really over? Has it ever ended? Well, it's not necessarily in the way that we treat people, but I think it's in the way of our financial system, the way it stands today. Thanks to Mike Rivero of his website, whatreallyhappened.com, I compiled some information to share with you in regards to kind of like where we stand now and what we are not knowing. So let me go ahead and share this with you, and let's take it back a little bit. In the good old days, after George Washington and the boys won the war to free us from the Bank of England's predatory and impoverishing practices, they set up a revolutionary economic system. The government created and issued all the public currency, spending it into circulation to purchase what the government needed. Then, after the currency circulated through society to fuel commerce, was taxed back to the government to balance the books. Simple, isn't it? Well, banks existed, of course, but they were kept off to one side. And the use of the banks was optional for the people of the United States back then. It was possible to go through one's entire life without dealing with a bank, if one chose to do so. This system not only reserved the choice whether to use the bank to the people, but it was a stable system because as debt increased, the people could voluntarily choose to stop borrowing from the bank. That was one of the most important freedoms won during the Revolution, the freedom to say no to the banks. Well, after the Revolutionary War ended, a group of people basically huddled and created the first Bank of the United States, which was a 20-year charter that wasn't renewed, but then, a short time later, those same people and a few others added on created the second Bank of the United States. And they wanted the charter renewed and almost duped Congress to vote that in. But then President Andrew Jackson stepped in and basically routed them out. He was nearly assassinated 3 months later. The charter was not renewed, and Andrew Jackson, for those of you wondering, if those saying he's racist and this and that and the other, I bet you didn't know this. But Andrew Jackson is the only president of the 44 we've had in U.S. history. Let's not forget, Grover Cleveland served 2 separate terms, so he counts twice. Andrew Jackson's the only president in U.S. history to ever pay off the national debt. And you wondered why they wanted his life on a platter. We move on to the Civil War and into the 20th century, and I'll backtrack to that major thing in the Civil War in a couple of minutes. But in 1913, a corrupt Congress and a corrupt president changed the structure of the nation's economy and stole your freedom to say no. The economic system was reverted to a mirror of that same system the nation fought a revolution to be free of. The power to issue money was taken away from the government and given to the bankers, and from that day onward, all money in circulation was created as the result of a loan at interest from the bankers to the government, to business, and to the people. There is no exception. Every dollar paid in salary, spent to purchase food or gas or anything else, or even paid in taxes, began as an interest-bearing loan. There is no money in circulation in the United States that did not start out as a loan at interest from the bankers at the privately owned Federal Reserve System. Now keep in mind, in 1913, another group of people similar to those who created the first and second banks of the United States respectively created the third Bank of the United States. That was shortly renamed the Federal Reserve, not too long after that. That is what we know now. Today's Federal Reserve was originally the third Bank of the United States when it was created in 1913. But from that moment on, the freedom of the people to refuse to borrow from the banks and to refuse to pay interest was stripped away. To participate in the commerce of the United States at all means, being forced to use money loaned at interest to the profit of the bankers and the impoverishment of the public. Your freedom to say no was stolen by Congress that year in 1913, in all likelihood, without your permission, and most definitely before you were even born. Think about this, folks. Things happening behind everyone's back is basically a killer. And it is horrible that these things continue to happen, and yet nothing has ever been done to change that economic system. When you have lost the freedom to say no, when you have no choice but to pay a percentage of your earnings as interest to the bankers, whether in private debt or taxes to cover the gargantuan debts by the U.S. government itself, you are a slave to the bankers. And because more money is owed to the bankers than actually exists, because of the interest charged on the loan that created the money, the debt slavery is permanent. No matter how hard you work, no matter how much you sacrifice, the debt can never be paid off. This system is intentionally designed to trap the nation's population permanently in unpayable debt, to make them slaves to that debt and to the bankers. This is the purpose behind the design of the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and indeed every private central bank issuing the public currency as a loan at interest. This is why today every nation is drowning in created debt, enslaved to the private bankers. And this, my friends, is the reason for ever-increasing taxes and decreasing benefits to pay the bankers their unpayable interest on the public currency. Now, for that enslavement to succeed, your right and freedom to refuse that bank's interest-bearing money must be stripped away. The government must force you to use that private central bank's currency loaned to you at interest via the legal tender laws. Therein lies your slave chains. You are ordered by the government, on pain of prison or possibly death, to use the banker's money and to pay the interest charged by the banker through your taxes. I want everyone to please remember this when it comes to slavery. How we treat each other equally is one thing. Free people have the right to say no. Free people have a right to decide for themselves what medium of exchange they will use and to choose not to involve the bankers. But have you noticed, folks, that during this pandemic, for some of you want to call it that, during this time that everybody has had their lives changed, and not necessarily for the better, have you noticed they've been talking about a digital currency possibly coming? This is part of the plan, folks. There is no freedom without the freedom to say no. Slaves cannot say no when ordered to surrender the products of their labor to their masters. And because of all this, you are a slave. And unfortunately, so am I to that effect. All of us are slaves. Now let's take it back a little bit, and I want you to think about something. This is a different type of slavery I'm talking about. As we all know, in 1863, basically the very beginning of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves. But many didn't know, because the Emancipation Proclamation had little impact on those who lived in Texas, all because of the minimal number of Union troops that were there to enforce the new order. Now, of course, 2 years later came the surrender of General Lee in April 1865 and the arrival of General Granger's regiment. Now, this is all around the time that Lincoln was assassinated, of course, 1 week after the Civil War ended. But around that time, with Granger's regiment arriving, the forces were finally strong enough to influence and overcome the resistance. 2 months following the end of the war and Lincoln's assassination, which is why we recognize Juneteenth, which is June 19th, as the official end of slavery. That type of slavery is one thing, but from a financial standpoint, it's another. Let me go just a little more in depth on this. Returning to 1913, think about where we are now in 2020. The end of the first half of this incredibly roller coaster or Wile E. Coyote cliff falling year. And we still haven't even gotten to November yet. Think about it, folks. There's a lot more to come in the second act. If you think 2020 is crazy, think about what happened in 1913. I did mention a corrupt Congress. I did mention a corrupt president and a racist in Woodrow Wilson. 1913 proved to be a transformative year for the nation's economy. First, with the passage of the 16th Amendment, also known as the Income Tax Amendment, and the false claim that it had been ratified. I'm not going to go into more information as to why this was not ratified, but all I understand is that when it was ratified, some key people were not even there, and it was passed without their attendance. If they were there may not have been an income tax law. At a later date, I'll talk more about it, but remember, income taxes are now due on July 15th, given that 3-month extension given by President Trump. But that same year, and apparently unwilling to risk another questionable amendment, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act over the Christmas holiday in 1913, while members of Congress who were opposed to the measure were at home. This was a very underhanded deal, as the Constitution explicitly vests Congress with the authority to issue the public currency, does not authorize its delegation, and thus should have required a new amendment to transfer that authority to a private bank. It was clearly obvious that President Woodrow Wilson was pressured to sign it. And pass it Congress did. President Woodrow Wilson signed it as he promised the bankers he would in exchange for generous campaign contributions. And remember, this was all in his first term. And if you think about it, you look back at what Woodrow Wilson did, that changed everything. He could have said no, but he probably would have been assassinated. Give that some thought. He was pressured by the bankers. As much as many do not like him in regards to his racist ways, as far as looking at his country, clearly money and deep threats forced him to sign it. This was a decision which Woodrow Wilson later deeply regretted. And he actually said this in 1919. "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." Think about that quote from Woodrow Wilson and ask yourself, have we done anything to fix what is happening today from a financial perspective? Personally, I don't think it has. And based upon what he did, not because of the fact that Wilson was a racist, I actually applaud Princeton University for changing the name, or in the process of changing the name of the Woodrow Wilson Building. Not because of its racism, but for the fact that from a financial perspective, he ruined this country. Based upon that, I don't understand why he actually had that name there in the first place. I wonder if they're going to change that name of the service area in the New Jersey Turnpike. But whatever the case, this man changed everything, all with the signing of his name on a bill that didn't have to go through as underhandedly as it did. Now let me close by saying this. Slavery exists only because the slaves have been taught to believe that slavery is the way the world is supposed to be. Beliefs and chains used to enslave free people. No chains of steel ever bound a human tighter than the chains made of the beliefs with which we are indoctrinated while young in the state schools and the churches. Slaves used to be held prisoner by their belief in rule by divine right. Then the slaves regained their freedom when they realized that divine right is only an illusion created by the enslavers to trick the people into obedient servitude. Then slaves were held prisoner by their belief in rule by chattel ownership of one's body. Then the slaves regained their freedom when they realized that one person owning another is an illusion created by the enslavers to trick the people again into obedient servitude. Today, the modern slaves, that is you, that is me, that is all of us, we are held prisoner by their belief in compound interest, that they owe money that never existed to repay money created out of thin air. And you modern slaves will regain your freedoms when you realize that private central banking is just another illusion created by the enslavers, once again, to trick you into obedient servitude. So stop believing the hype and start crying freedom. This may not necessarily be the slavery that you expected me to talk about, but that, my friends, is what drives me crazy. And please, give that some thought. We need each other now more than ever, but in order to truly break chains of financial slavery, we have to do something to change that system. And then, and only then, will we have a chance of true equality. Please make sure you follow me at Crazy Tom Show on Twitter and Instagram. And of course, you can check out my What Drives Me Crazy page on Facebook So please feel free to check out some of the other interesting articles that I put out. Thank you guys again for joining us. Again, Crazy Tom here. Glad you were able to listen for a little while, and be ready for another edition of What Drives Me Crazy coming up in a couple of days. But enjoy your end of June actually, and most importantly to each and every one of you, love one another, and please stay safe.